Take a look at this article. Trump ties Greenland threats to him not winning Nobel Peace Prize in letter to Norway's leader. Imagine someone from 10 years ago reading this, or even 6 months ago. I mean, it's insane. This is the president of the United States of America in an open letter to the Prime Minister of Norway saying that the reason for him threatening Greenland, to take Greenland from Denmark, not ruling out using military force, the reason for this is because he didn't get the Nobel Peace Prize. I mean, it's crazy. I don't even know where to begin. First of all, the Norwegian Prime Minister doesn't even have any influence in who gets the Peace Prize. It's an independent committee. Secondly, I mean, how is this, something dignified to do as, the president of the United States? Actual, baby behavior, throwing a fit because you didn't get the Peace Prize. And that's not even the worst part. The worst part is that this is his reason for threatening a NATO ally, one of the United States' closest allies, threatening to take their territory just because he wants to. I mean, and this even goes against what he said earlier about, security concerns. Now he just says it's because he didn't get the Peace Prize. I mean, there's no consistency, no logic behind anything. And even those earlier claims were also, completely bogus. He said that the United States needed Greenland for security concerns. But it's a part of Denmark, a NATO ally. It's a NATO territory. And Denmark would have allowed you to have as many military bases on Greenland as the United States wants. So what security concerns? And the funny thing is, it became so obviously, just a pretense that it was a pretense when, some European countries, sent troops up to Greenland. If Trump's claims were true, that he were really concerned about Greenland security, then, I mean, he should have been pleased that his European allies in NATO, as a NATO mission, were sending troops to reinforce Greenland. I mean, shouldn't that be exactly what he wants? His allies sending more troops to a territory he's, where he's concerned about the security, against Russia and China. But no. Then he answers by putting tariffs and threatening, even more tariffs on those countries who support Denmark against his closest allies. I mean, it's just insanity. I mean, and that's why I made this video. I just needed to crash out and just, if you want to hear, tell me my opinions on how Europe should move on from this point forward, because clearly, I mean, just reading this title, Europe can't trust the US any longer. It's clear that right now is a very turbulent time for Europe and the EU, and Europe must become less dependent on the US if it wants to, survive as an independent continent, and not just a part of the US sphere of influence. And for context, I'm Swedish, so I'm a EU citizen. This video is, if you hadn't noticed already, it's from the European perspective, and I am pro EU. So if you're an EU skeptic, then you might not agree with my conclusions. But so right now the discussion is a lot about Greenland, not about the United States threats against its allies, against us in Europe. And of course, this is the biggest discussion right now, as it certainly should be. But there's also a lot of other factors, I think, we need to think about as a reason for lessening our dependence on the United States. I mean, we have seen how the United States under Trump again and again has shown how they aren't a reliable ally for Europe, and how they don't view us as equals. They don't respect us. They don't respect us, and I wouldn't go as far as to say that the United States has become our enemies, but it certainly doesn't look like it's impossible that it becomes that way in the future. I mean, I don't know. I don't understand their rationale behind their actions, but the pattern is clear. They are again and again betraying our trust, and it's clear that we cannot be so dependent on a state that doesn't share our interests, that doesn't share our values. And so I'm going to go through these points one by one. So first of all, the tariffs, right? Trump, announced his tariffs last year on Liberation Day, breaking a tradition of free trade and basically putting tariffs on all of the world, including the European Union. Showing just how what do you call it? How reckless he is, how he can do anything on a whim, and there's no way of predicting what we'll do next. So there's no reliability in the US as a partner right now, I would say. And also recently he at least threatened to put on tariff on 8 European nations who supported Greenland, who sent troops to Greenland, and that those would go up to even 20%, I think, in June if they don't comply by then, which just shows that it's not just about the US balancing its trade deficits. It's also about punishing countries who doesn't do as the United States says, even if those countries are European allies. Then doubts about NATO. I mean, first of all, doubts about NATO. How would Trump respond? In a Russian attack, would he actually support Europe? I mean, he's been saying for many years that Europe isn't important for the United States, that he wants to withdraw US troops from Europe, and he's also been very friendly with Putin, inviting him to Alaska, rolling out the red carpet, and along with that, he has also decreased massively the support for Ukraine, and begun talking less harshly on Russia, which is the complete opposite of what Europe would have wanted. Europe wants a United States that supports Ukraine, that makes sure that Russia is punished for waging war in Europe. I mean, and that should be in the US interest as well. I mean, Russia is like the traditional big enemy of the United States. So I don't understand why they don't take this chance to weaken Russia. And even worse, when Trump is trying to negotiate, a peace in Ukraine, he does so without input from Ukraine or Europe. Europe will not be a part of the Ukraine peace deal, US envoy says. So this was from last year in February. So I mean, it's just a complete disregard of European interest, not even inviting them to the meeting. Neither Europe as a whole or even Ukraine, who's fighting the war. It's it's like the Munich agreement vibes all over again. Then also interfering in European democracy, by openly supporting certain right-wing populist parties. And I think no matter your political position, even if you support those right-wing parties, I think everyone in Europe should have the position that it's us Europeans that decide, who runs our countries. Sure, a European can vote on which party, he or she wants, but he shouldn't do so because the president of the United States, supports a certain party. You shouldn't go and tell other countries' people what to vote on. That's an internal matter. And it's also very clear that he's supporting, these right-wing populist parties because they are opposed to the EU, which is, again, ties in with Trump's, deep, it seems, disdain for the EU. He's always trying to divide Europe. It seems, always, trying to talk with the individual countries instead of the EU as a whole. I mean, there was I don't remember exactly how long it lasted, but it was a very long period after Trump's inauguration where he basically ignored the Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. Which just shows how he doesn't really regard the EU as a player in world politics, which is weird considering that Europe is, or at least was, one of the United States' closest allies, and a strong Europe should be in the interest of the United States. This I forgot this article. Will Trump pull Italy, Austria, Poland, Hungary from the EU? So this was from the new U.S. national security strategy, where they talked about destabilizing the European Union. They want to exert influence to make some European countries leave the Union, which why would it be in the interest of the United States to destabilize the European Union? I mean, clearly they understand that the EU, Europe as a whole, is stronger than its individual members, so they want to, divide and conquer. That logic I understand, but I don't understand why they should want to do that against an ally. But clearly Trump doesn't see the EU as an ally. Okay, so if we then go to the question if the EU is too weak to respond. I mean, if Europe is supposed to break free from the United States to become less dependent on the US, we have to ask ourselves, do we actually have the will to do that? Because I see some pretty big weaknesses in our union right now, even though I'm a pro EU person, but I see some clear weaknesses. So far, trade deals and the trade negotiations with the US and the EU it's clearly been a humiliation for the EU. We've just been trying to appease Trump. I mean, we agreed to 15%, tariffs for European exports to America, but like 0% for the reverse. U.S. exports to Europe, completely unfair deal. Which but it was thought that if we at least can get this deal, then we will have predictability and we will have something to work with long term. But as it's been shown, Trump doesn't care. If he sees weakness, he's just going to try to take more and more, and he's never going to get enough. And then a better approach would perhaps have been to act strong like China, and to make sure that Trump understands that the EU is a strong player, and that he can't treat the EU however he wants. There's consequences. And then we come to my second point. The EU is slow to act. I mean, that's an kind of an inevitability. Excuse me. With a large democracy like the EU, every institution has to have its say. Every member state, of course, needs to have its say, and there's long negotiations. But that really is a problem when it comes to these, especially someone like Trump, who can do something on a whim. Then it's important to be able to act fast and respond to that, which the EU sometimes lack, even in areas like trade, where the Commission, has increased powers compared to other areas. And the EU is also internally divided. I mean, right-wing, left-wing populists, being big EU skeptics, and if, for example, Le Pen or Bardella in France or the AfD in Germany comes to power, and I can't predict the future, but I'm guessing that it will be a lot harder for the EU to take any decisions, because these people will just be opposed to anything, wanting less power concentrated in the EU institutions. It's not going to help with the EU's inability to act. And then, of course, Europe is too dependent on the US, which hinders our possible actions. With that said, I would propose three different ways the EU could move forward. And this is just my predictions that I made up myself. But I mean, the three kind of big ways it can go is either the EU just collapses. It can't handle the pressure from a hostile US. What if they actually invade Greenland and the EU doesn't respond? Europe doesn't respond. That's a big show of weakness. People might lose hope in the EU to actually be able to accomplish anything. But more importantly, if right-wing populists like Le Pen, AfD, wins in these big European countries like France and Germany, I mean, without those countries being on board for the EU project, then nothing will happen. And if they are extreme enough, then perhaps they will try to leave the EU. I mean, I don't think this is a likely scenario, but if they try to leave the EU, France, Germany, I mean, then the whole union will just probably collapse, or at least be very weakened. The more probable scenario, though, is that either the EU survives, it can hold its ground, status quo, basically. It can fend off Trump, it can ensure that Greenland isn't invaded, it can come up with some acceptable trade deal, but it pretty much stays the same. Or the third option, that the EU becomes even stronger because of all these large threats against Europe, forces all the member states and the people of Europe to come together and work together even more to overcome these obstacles. And that's at least what I hope, that we see this necessity, that we can have more European cooperation, we can centralize more power to the EU institutions to make faster, to make more impactful decisions, and that the EU can really show its power on the world stage, because Europe is a rich and a powerful continent, but it's divided. But if the EU could come out of this crisis a lot stronger, then that would be good for lessening our dependence on the United States. And the way to strengthen the EU, at least according to my opinion, is to do more trade deals like Mercosur, the Mercosur deal between the EU and South America, or some South American countries. which is really important to diversify our export markets. So right now we are exporting a lot of goods to the US, and Europe is really dependent on being able to export because that's a lot of our economy. We produce a lot of exports. And so if we can have access to more markets to export our products to, then say in a future trade war with the United States, we will have more leverage. And we will be able to negotiate from a better position because we will have alternative markets to export to. And so this is both boosting European economy by getting more markets to export to, and also becoming less dependent on the United States. And there are also many more trade deals in being negotiated right now. For example, a big one is with India. So if you could get trade deals with Mercosur, the Mercosur deal is almost completely finished. It just needs to be approved by Parliament. If we could get South America, India, Mexico, these big markets, then it could open up a lot of possibilities for the European economy and lessen our reliance on the US market, even though of course the US market is the biggest in the world. We will never be completely detached from the US market. They will always have a big influence because of that, but at least we can lessen our dependence on it, if not becoming completely independent. Then we need to focus on things like big tech, where we should be moving away from American big tech services. For example, in this Politico article, they argue that EU banks should reduce their reliance on US big tech. And in this article down here, it talks about how the International Criminal Court has ditched Microsoft Office for a European alternative. And I think that is, a good beginning to begin making sure that at least our most important institutions and like banks and ports and government is not dependent on American solutions but on European solutions. And then I think like private companies can do, small businesses can do what they want, but when it comes to these big important institutions, especially government institutions, then I think having US software could be a backdoor for the US to gain influence over Europe. And then regarding the dollar, or more broadly the US financial system, we need to make sure that we become less dependent on the dollar, which is easier said than done, but we can at least try to strengthen the euro, which can be done through many different ways. But at least have that mindset of how to weaken the dominance of the US dollar. Then we also, of course, need to ramp up our defense spending, which we have already done, but there's a long way to go. To be able to defend against Russia, of course, but now it also seems to be able to defend against the United States. Then some more points. I think we need a more centralized EU, which means less unanimity when voting. So in some topics, of course, need unanimity because otherwise the member states wouldn't agree to give up so much sovereignty. But I think we really need to reduce the amount of areas where we need unanimity in the EU, because in countries like Hungary, which is clearly kind of a Russian puppet, not really, but it feels like that. then it should be that those single countries can't block the entire EU. And in line with that, also more power to the EU institutions like the Commission to act on behalf of the EU. And then this ties in with, less dependence on the US financial system. I think it's a really good suggestion to introduce a single European stock exchange, among other things, to, integrate the European markets. Because, a stronger, more integrated Europe means that we can stand up to countries like the US or China much, much better. But that's about it, I think. And just to clarify, I do think it's really important that the EU becomes less dependent on the United States, that it becomes more independent, and that it can act on its own on the world stage. But with that said, I think if the Americans want, if they can elect, a reasonable president, then I think it's in the interest of Europe to work with America, to have close ties with the United States. But that, depends on if the United States wants the same. And right now, with someone like Trump as president, it doesn't seem possible for the EU to have a good relationship with the United States, even though I, of course, want there to be a strong alliance between the US and Europe. I think it would really, benefit both Europe and the US to, face the threats coming from, China together. But instead, right now, infighting and breaking apart, which I would say is 90%, 99% Trump's fault and not Europe's. Because Europe has been willing to compromise. We have been willing to make trade deals, very favorable to the United States. But still, Trump doesn't respect the EU. He doesn't seem to see us as allies. And therefore, I think we need to have this discussion. And long term, we need to move away from the US influence. And so that in the future, we can be allies as equals and not allies as in Europe is in the US sphere of influence. But yeah, that's just my thoughts. I really don't think this video will do well, but I just wanted to express my thoughts to myself. Making a video makes you have to think through them a lot more, and you can, see more clearly where you yourself stand. And and maybe it will be fun in 10 years to look back at this video and see what I thought about the future of Europe and how it really went. So we will have to stay tuned for that.